Hi, this is Tracy from Girls to Grow blog. Thanks so much for stopping by the YouTube channel today. And we're going to cover one of my favorite topics that I talk about often on the blog. And we're going to look into prayer today. And specifically, we're going to look at 6 steps for how to pray when we're anxious or afraid. Now, prayer is definitely a discipline. It's a spiritual discipline that doesn't always come easily for me. It takes work and it takes time and a still mind and a quiet heart. And I like to study it often, but I have to be careful that I just don't spend all my time studying prayer and not actually doing it. But as I've gone through the Bible and studied various prayers, one that I found that I think we can learn a lot from is Jacob's prayer in Genesis chapter 32. And you're probably familiar with the background to this story. Jacob is headed back home after being away for 20 years. And he knows that at some point he's likely going to come into contact with his brother Esau. And we know they didn't really part on the best of terms. So he sends a message ahead of he and his group, and he hopes to find grace in Esau's sight. Well, his messenger returns and basically says Esau's on his way to meet you, and he's got 400 men with him. Well, to quote the Bible, it says Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, as I'm sure we would be as well. And maybe you have been there, obviously not in those circumstances, but we've likely all had a time when we're stressed, we're anxious, we're afraid, and we're not sure what to do. So Jacob does the best thing you can do in those situations, and he goes to God in prayer. So I want us to look at some verses from Genesis chapter 32 as we look through that prayer and see what we can learn from it when we're afraid or distressed, or even if we're just seeking God's direction. So the first step for how to pray when we're anxious or afraid is to remind God of his promises. In verse 9, it says, "And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord which saidst unto me, return unto thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee." Here, Jacob is saying back to God, God, here's what you told me. You told me to come back to this country and to this people. You know, it's not like God forgets his promises, but how powerful it is for us to pray God's words back to him. And here Jacob mentions how God was present in the lives of his forefathers. He mentions Abraham and Isaac. And then he says, I'm doing, God, what you told me to do. And he points out that, God, you said you would deal well with me as I obeyed you. And that's a comfort to us to pray the words of God and the promises of God. I've often mentioned when I parented teens, James 1:5, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. And that was a promise that I prayed often when I was parenting teenagers and in other situations where I was looking for God's wisdom. Think of other promises that apply to your situation when we're worn out. Isaiah 40:29 says that God will give us strength. Psalm 23:4 says that he'll walk with us through the valley of the shadow of death. And 2 Corinthians 12:9 tells us that his grace is sufficient. So whatever you're walking through, find a promise of God in his word that applies to that, and then just pray it back to him. The second step is to acknowledge our unworthiness. In verse 10, Jacob says, I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. Jacob recognizes he's not worthy of how God has worked in his life. We know his background. We know how he tricked his father Isaac in order to get the birthright. We know other situations where he didn't deal honestly. So we'd probably agree, yeah, Jacob, you're not deserving of God's mercy. But we know that we aren't either. We know the things that we have done that we would think would exempt us from God's mercy, but we know his mercy is everlasting. And as we come to God in prayer, we want to come humbly and admit our own sins and failures. The third step in how to pray for when we're anxious or afraid is to recognize God's blessing. Again, in verse 10, Jacob says, For with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I am become 2 bands. Now, we don't know exactly when Jacob left home what he took with him, but we assume he didn't have a lot, considering he used a pile of rocks for a pillow on his first night out. Yet now he tells us he comes back to his homeland with a large family. He's got servants, flocks, and herds of animals. So he has definitely been blessed. And he's recognizing that as he says this to God. And whether we see our blessings as great or small, every single one of them comes from God. So as we come to him in prayer, it's important to be aware of that every day and to acknowledge all the blessings that God has given us. Our fourth step in praying when we're anxious or afraid is to just ask for what we want. In verse 11, Jacob says, Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau. He states exactly what he wants, and his prayer is pretty basic. It's save my life. And sometimes it might feel hard for us just to come out and ask God for what we want, but that's a major part of prayer. We can pray for our requests specifically and directly. Maybe it's a healing you need in your life, it's a job situation, it's a financial need, but let's pray specifically for what we want as we come to God in prayer. The fifth step is to admit our fears. In verse 11, Jacob says, For I fear him, speaking of Esau, lest he will come and smite me and the mother with the children. So Jacob tells God exactly what he's feeling. And we know God already knows our feelings. He knows all of our emotions, but Jacob tells him anyway. And whatever situation you're facing that has caused you distress or anxiety, tell God what your emotions are. Yes, he knows, but just explain to him. Say, God, here's how I'm feeling about this situation. Maybe you're angry, you're frightened, you're hurt, but share your feelings with God as you pray. And then finally, the sixth step for how to pray when we're anxious or afraid is to rest in the promises of God. Verse 12, Jacob says, speaking to God, "And thou sayest, I will surely do thee good, and make thy seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude." So he's praying back to God, this promise. And I think Jacob is saying, God, if Esau kills me and my family, how is what you said going to come to pass? Here he is, he's quoting back to God again what God had told Jacob previously. And what we have to lean on in our prayer life is God's faithfulness. We know that God is true to his word. We know that he keeps his promises. He's delivered on his promises in the past. I'm sure we can all recite times when God has answered our prayer and he's been faithful to his promises. So we can be confident that going forward, he's doing exactly the same thing. So whatever our needs are today, I hope that you'll take them to God in prayer. And I hope, especially during those times when we're anxious, we're afraid, we're distressed, that we'll remember this prayer of Jacob and we'll do the same. We'll take these needs to God and rely on him and his faithfulness to keep his promises. Thanks again for stopping by. Have a great day.